Hey there, guys. It's Sean, and I'm here doing a Talk Tuesday on a Sunday. Just doing the best I can to hang in there. And I'm also repping my ASU basketball shirt. They just got into the NCAA tournament, and they're going to need some help because they barely got in. But I'm not here to talk about ASU basketball, though that would be fun and a bit morose. But I'm going to talk about Luke 12 and how you might approach looking at Luke 12 to be able to do a Young Life, Wyldlife, Young Lives, Capernaum, Young Life, any of those club talks. So when you look at Luke chapter 12, one of the things you'll notice, especially if you look in a red letter Bible where it has the words of Jesus in red, you'll see that almost the entire chapter is Jesus speaking. And this isn't the sort of chapter that we normally use for Young Life talks. We normally like to tell stories where Jesus is with people or he's doing something, he's interacting. And here is just kind of like lecturing and lecturing. So we don't normally turn to these chapters in club talks, but I think we might be missing something here. And hopefully what I'm about to show you here is something you go, wow, that'd be important about the gospel. But we're going to look there. So even though it's not a normal passage that you might look at, we always need to ask ourselves, what is it that the Bible teaches about the gospel? What is it that is Jesus's message, not necessarily just the sections that we want to highlight? And so one of the things that you can find in this chapter is in verse 22, it talks about something that I think that every kid in club and probably every leader and every person out there struggles with and needs to know what Jesus says about life, which is about the topic of anxiety. And so when you look at Luke chapter 12, starting verse 22 through the end of the chapter, you see Jesus' teaching on anxiety. You can also find it in Matthew 6. So I think this is a great place to look. And when you look there, I've created a little outline that you can get in my little handout. But I think there's 5 things that goes through in these passages. First off, Jesus says to not be anxious about your life. And he gives 3 different examples. He says, don't be anxious about your food. Don't be anxious about your body. Don't be anxious about your clothes. And right there, I mean, that just probably dials into something that a lot of us are anxious about. But Jesus isn't just restricting our anxiousness or possibility of being anxious to those 3 topics. He's really saying kind of like everything and anything that you might be anxious about. You could add in there, you know, your parents, your homework, your future, you know, whatever it is, your friendships. Jesus is saying, I want to address things that you could be anxious about. I don't want you to be anxious. He goes on to say in verse 23, he says, your life is greater than your worries. Life is greater than your worries or your stuff. And he gives 2 counter examples. This is the third part. He says, example number 1, look at the birds in the air, the ravens. God feeds them food. They don't need to join, a team, an agricultural team to try to come up with all this. God feeds the ravens. So we have the birds. And then the second one is that God, the second example of not needing to be worried, it would be his example of the lilies or the flowers or even the grass in the field. And he says, God clothes all of these beautifully on his own. They don't need to sign up and start working. God made them intrinsically beautiful because that's just what God did. So anyway, it's about the way that God provides as opposed to thinking that our anxiousness, our worry, our extra work is going to be able to give us the things that we want in this life. The fourth point in my outline would be that we need to, that we get to choose what we want to set our heart on. And Jesus says to not seek or set our heart on either food or drink or worry. Instead, he says, do seek and do set your heart on God's kingdom and God's plan to use you for his purposes. So he doesn't just say, don't do this, which so often you kind of hear that, or kids might expect that don't. Jesus is saying here, this is where you find life. This is what you should seek. This is where you should set your heart. And then in verse 32 through 34, especially 34, Jesus gives a fantastic way to kind of do a diagnosis of your heart. And it's to ask yourself, where is your treasure? Because wherever your treasure is, that's where your heart is also. So here's a couple main points. That was a brief outline, and I have a little sheet there if you want to look at it. But here's a couple points. Main points that you might be able to use in a club talk. One would be that if you've ever been in a situation that's made you anxious, or maybe you like struggle with anxiety and you know that, Jesus wants to be with you in your anxiety and to reorient your anxiety in a different direction. So don't be anxious about this. Instead, have this. Another one is that anxiety can come from trying to solve our own problems, or maybe in some ways to build my own kingdom or my own world. I'm going to build my own world through my food, through my body, through my clothes, through my friends, through my success. as opposed to participating in God's kingdom and the plans that he has for you here. And another main point could be that the security that many people look for in possessions or in body image or all those things is really only meant to be found in God. So this idea of what we get anxious about, you could ask people or yourself even, what is it that you tend to be fixated with, or try to, what are the things that stress you out? And God says, really, I don't want you to have to worry, work, toil, spin, labor, any of these things. I want to give you a different concern, which is mine. I'll be honest really quickly. I thought about some of the things that I get anxious about, even in Young Life and in ministry and other kind of similar pursuits. I thought about this when I was studying this. It's about the things I actually get worried about are if they are contributing to like Sean's kingdom. That's just where I mostly get worried, rather than just thinking about and trusting that God is the one that's building this kingdom, and I'll just participate as best I can and just kind of leave it at that. Here are some things that it shows us about Jesus. One is that Jesus is aware of our anxiety, whether it's our body or our clothes or our food or anything that makes us anxious. Jesus knows about it, and that's something that you could share with your friends. If you've been anxious this week, Jesus literally knows exactly what you've been worried about. Two is that Jesus wants to give you a role in his kingdom. So his kingdom is what God is doing here on earth. He wants you to participate, and he wants to give you an active role in that. The third thing is that Jesus desires for your life to contribute towards what is eternal rather than just things that are temporary. So hopefully that would excite people to be about something that's not just temporary. A post that's going to be, an online post, even this one, that's going to be forgotten, a day or a week or a month, whatever. God wants you to participate in what's eternal. What does this have to do with our life? Well, one is that anxiety existed in Jesus's day just as much as it does in ours. We might think, oh, well, our world is just so stressful. We have all these pressures on our shoulders, and true. However, the reason that Jesus was talking about this in, 30 AD was people were feeling the same way. And so anxiety is not a new invention, and Jesus has a plan for it because he's the creator of everything eternally. And another one is that Jesus actually wants to use our anxiety, because we all have anxiety in different ways, to show us our need for God. Anxiety is where we spin and think, I will solve my own problems, and no matter what, no matter how hard we try, we will not be able to do that on our own. Maybe we can solve some, but we can't solve all of our problems, and that's really meant to lead us to God. Actually, I have a friend who wrote a book about this called The Anxious Christian, Rhett Smith, and I'll have a link for that if you're interested. Now, here's a couple of technical details, and then I'll give you some illustrations. One is we just wanted to find words that maybe someone who walked into club for the first time and doesn't ever hear anything from the Bible, we want to make sure we define those words. So right straight away in verse 22, it talks about disciples. I tend to always just say Jesus' closest friends. In verse 22, it also talks about being anxious. And others ways to put this would be to not be worried, or to have like a deep care in a significant way that might be kind of overwhelming. This is also the same Greek word that Paul uses in Philippians 4:6. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, so on and so forth. It talks about things, to be honest, I think some people might be, I know exactly what it is, but I, for whatever reason, don't. I had to look it up. To be able to sow, or to reap, or to toil, or to spin. I knew what some of those meant, but basically to sow or to reap have to do with agricultural, like sowing seed and then reaping seed. The birds don't have to do agricultural work, so that's what that's talking about there in verse 24. In verse 27, toil or spin. Toil is to labor or to work or to strive. And to spin actually is the idea there in the word in Greek. What's going on there is the same idea about like spinning like yarn or cloth. So the process of spinning fibers into a material. And what it's talking about there in verse 27 is about the flowers don't need extra, ornamentation, don't need extra work, don't need like extra doilies or some sort of yarn around them to make them look more beautiful. They are just beautiful because that's the way that God made them. In fact, my sweet daughter Lily, my wife Erin, and I named her that because that is the way that we knew God had already made her before she was born. So that's what we're talking about there. In verse 27, it says Solomon in all of his glory wasn't clothed as one of these. And if you're not familiar with Solomon, you can look up about how he had everything, like when it came to power, influence, wisdom, but also like stuff. He had all the stuff. You can look in 1 Kings 10 and also 2 Chronicles 9 and read about just this list of all these things that people would bring to him and just the amazing resources that he had that were from all around the world. He was never lacking in anything, but even Solomon in all of his splendor wasn't clothed as one of these that didn't need to do any work at all. So there's that. It says, do not seek in verse 29, and that just means to search. You don't need to search. And the J.B. Phillips version, which some people love to use, translates it this way. It says, you must not set your heart on. And so this idea of seeking or searching, it would be like when you're really wanting something so much, it maybe set your heart on it. In verse 32, it talks about selling possessions. Now, you don't necessarily have to sell possessions, everything, though you could. The idea is that you would let go and not hold on to things, thinking that those are the things that would relieve your anxiety, but that you would have those open-handed as needed. So there's that. Otherwise, we could actually depend too much on giving things away as our solution to our problem and not turning to God. So just merely kind of giving all of your stuff away, thinking that will solve your problem, it probably just creates more problems. The idea is letting go of things that you want to hold on to so that Jesus can fill that in your life instead. And then the last one, it says, seek his kingdom in verse 31. And just look back, whose kingdom? It's the Father's kingdom. It says that in verse 30. And one thing about seeking his kingdom there, it's a present tense. So you don't just necessarily seek God's kingdom once as a solution to your problems, but it's a present, ongoing sense. So keep seeking his kingdom is the response when we're anxious. It's a habit that you do over and over. All right, 2 illustrations and then I'll be done. The first one is it talks about birds and lilies and flowers and grass. And I know this might sound crazy, but maybe consider bringing in, I know this would be wild, but like a bird, be like, does it need an outfit? No. Or your dog, I guess. I mean, some people, I guess, dress up their dogs, be like, this is just silly. Look at this outfit on this dog. It doesn't need it. I don't know. Maybe that's a bad idea. Or I don't have a real flower. I just don't happen to have one, but I have this. Oh, here's a sunflower. This is a little better. But you could bring in a real flower, maybe a beautiful rose or just whatever, and say, would this be any better if we put some sort of yarn on it or made some sort of outfit for it? And you go, no, it's beautiful just the way it is. And that's the way that God's made you. I think that is a good message, not only for the women in the room, but also for the men, to be honest. So you could just straight up bring some of those object lessons in there. One at the end there in verse 34, and when it talks about where your treasure is, there your heart is also. I think you could bring in like a little treasure chest. Maybe you have like a box of trinkets or a special treasures box or something like that. Or I happen to have one here. It's really heavy. But you could bring in a safe. I just happen to have a safe that we use for our Young Life office for camp deposits. Sorry, that was heavy. But you could just say, what are the things that you would that mean so much to you that you'd put them in here, because wherever your treasure is, that's where your heart is. So what are the things that you actually hold on to so much that you'd want to keep them? Maybe it's your car keys or your money or your degrees or whatever it is. Say, that shows you what you treasure the most. Maybe it's your social media profile, whatever it might be. That's where your heart is. And so just talking about what that means and where we can actually find our treasure, which is in things that will not rust or that moths can't destroy. And that is what is internal. So to turn to Christ and say, God, I want to be a part of what you're going to do. Not temporarily, but for eternity. So anyway, I hope those are some good ideas, or maybe 1 or 2 things in there is helpful. Be sure to look at the passage yourself and study it carefully and talk to others. But I hope that was a help. Have a great week. Go ASU. Bye.